Well, hello everybody, welcome. My name is Andrew Hall. I'm the facilitator this evening, and I'm also, maybe more importantly, Director of Sturt University's Institute for Land, Water and Society. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this Social Sciences Week webinar, Conflict and Extremism in Invasive Species Management, Perspectives from the Social Sciences. Social Sciences Week is a national program of events that brings social science researchers together with non-academic audiences to highlight the contribution social sciences make to our everyday lives. This webinar is produced by the Institute for Land, Water and Society, or ILWS for short. We are a research centre at Sturt University undertaking integrated environmental, social and economic research, including regional development, rural social issues and Indigenous business and cultural heritage. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which Sturt University's campuses are located, and pay respects to their elders past and present, and those emerging future elders. We also acknowledge and pay our respects to our Australian Indigenous colleagues and peers who are present in the meeting with us today. I just need to inform everybody that this webinar is being recorded. Participants' microphones and videos have been disabled, but you can ask questions in the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, and which is also recorded. Now, by way of introduction, invasive species management is a challenging social issue. Globally, feral and wild horse management continues to be a vexed problem. In Southeast Australia, including Kosciuszko National Park, a wide spectrum of views exists regarding management of feral horses in national parks, with some stakeholders advocating for no control of feral horses, some supporting control, and some hoping for complete eradication. Any attempts at developing solutions are confounded by misunderstanding of the ecological effects of horses on the environment, different positions on the cultural and social values of feral horses, ethical paradoxes around accepting and humane culling methods, and the political use of misinformation. All these are social issues. Similarly, in relation to deer management in northeast Victoria, management contentions revolve around the classification of deer as either game or pest, the cost and effectiveness of control methods, the costs and benefits of the distribution of deer, human safety, and the social licence of hunting. Our two presenters this evening are Dr. Alex Knight and Dr. Jen Bond. In this webinar, Jen and Alex will introduce some of the social complexities of management and point towards ongoing solutions. Each of the presenters will speak for about 20 minutes, and we'll follow that with a question and answer session. So just to introduce both of the speakers, I'll just do a quick bio for them both. Also presenting today is Dr. Jen Bond. Jen is a lecturer in human geography in the School of Environmental Sciences at Sturt University and is also a member of the Institute for Land, Water and Society. Jen graduated with an MSc in Agricultural Development in 2009 and a PhD in Rural Development in 2013, both from the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Her research focuses on natural resource conflict management and agricultural development. Her PhD investigated the complexities and interconnections of human-wildlife conflict, particularly human-elephant conflict, farmer-herder conflict, and cattle rustling in Kenya. In relation to agriculture, her work has focused on farmers' pesticide use and contestation between farmers and policymakers in relation to rice production in Vietnam. Jen joins the staff at CSU in September 2016 upon her return to Australia, and more recently has worked in Laos with fisheries practitioners in managing conflicts associated with conservation areas, illegal fishing and hydroelectric development. Her interest in human-wildlife conflict has continued, and she is now focusing on human-deer conflict in northeast Victoria. We will go straight now to Jen. Jen's presentation is called Deer Management in Northeast Victoria. How can social sciences help us? So Jen, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and thanks everyone for your time tonight. We really appreciate you being here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. I am starting to do some research around human-deer interaction in Victoria. So I've been looking mostly at secondary data at the moment, so records in the Victorian Public Records Office, the library, media and social media. I did start doing some interviews at the end of last year, but then COVID, bushfires, and then COVID. So they're on hold for a little bit at the moment. So I'm going to speak more generally about my research rather than presenting data as such. And I'm going to link into where I think the social sciences can really help and inform in this space. So I'm taking a human-wildlife conflict lens, and I don't know if you're familiar with this phrasing or this term, but this is a global literature. So conflict between humans and wildlife, or humans and animals, is seen throughout the world. So whether that's elephants destroying crops in Kenya, lions getting stock, it might be animals damaging infrastructure, getting into grain stores, damaging fences, all of these sort of things. So there can be real conflict. And I guess the key learning here is that we conceive human-wildlife conflict as essentially human-human conflict. So while the animal exists, a deer exists in the real world, in reality, it has an ecological materiality. How we as humans interact with it is really determined by us. So how we categorize them, how we make up rules around how people can interact with them, who can interact, where, how, who benefits from wildlife and who bears the costs. And these are often different groups of people, and that's where a lot of the conflict can come in. So I think it's just helpful to know that there is a global literature around this, and we can use it to start to ask a few questions and think about how that might apply to our case of deer in northeast Victoria. Now, from a perspective of how the social sciences can maybe come in here, I think one of the biggest benefits of social sciences is that it can help us to see the whole picture. So perhaps previously there's been a lot of focus on the ecological elements, perhaps even economics. That doesn't really show us the whole picture. We need a little bit more. And so I think, I'm not suggesting that the social sciences are going to tell us everything, but it's just adding some pieces to the puzzle. And a lot of that is based on challenging some of these assumptions that we might have, really questioning what do we know, how do we know what we know, how do different people understand the issue, and what is the issue, what is the problem. Bringing that back into a context and using that informed understanding of what's going on to then design processes that are perhaps more robust and moving from what can be quite a negative conflict space into a more productive conflict space. Because it's quite important to realize that conflict isn't bad as such, but it can be destructive. So we need conflict to be, in order to thresh out ideas and be innovative, but there is a threshold after which it becomes destructive. So we need to move the discussions back into that productive space. And I think that sort of understanding that we gain from the social sciences can help us with those processes. So some of my research is looking at, well, what is the problem? When we talk about deer and human-deer interaction in northeast Victoria, what is the problem? And in the conflict management literature, we focus on, or practice, we focus on needing to move discussions from where positions are to where interests are. And I've got a very oversimplified, very much oversimplified diagram here. But say we have a group A and a group B. Now, in terms of their positions, and this is made up for illustrative purposes, but say they have positions, and that's the level that we seem to be talking at the moment, but we really want to get underneath and understand what worldviews and what values and what different knowledges make up these different positions. So perhaps some people think that deer should be classified as a pest, whereas others think deer should be classified as game or wildlife. Now, if we take that position, that's where we start to run into some conflict, and it can be quite difficult to move past that. But if we try and get underneath that and think about what are the interests that are really underlying those positions, we start to get a little bit more insight or a little bit more nuance. So this is, again, for illustrative purposes. Someone who thinks that deer should be classified as game, that might be because their interest is that they want their hunting access to be maintained. Others who think that deer should be classified as pests, perhaps their underlying interest is that they actually, this specific area over here, they think no deer should be allowed in there. So when we look at it from a positions level, we can get some conflict. But if we dig deeper and try and interrogate and get some more nuance, we can find some spaces where we might get some common ground. And that's really, I think, where the social sciences can help. Obviously, there are underlying values that form these interests, and there are other attitudes and intermediary factors. So I don't mean to say that this is this simple. By no means is it. And what's really important to really acknowledge is that these groups don't really necessarily exist in the nice categories that we often put them in. So often in management practices, we talk about stakeholders as being hunters, farmers, community people, managers. I mean, and what the literature shows us is actually people don't, or their worldviews and their ideas of what should be, what is, don't fall that neatly into these boxes. And so some of my research is really trying to get away from those boxes and ask people about how they feel about these different issues, what's important to them. And like Alex was saying, really try and include those hidden voices and get those alternative voices into the discussion. So, and that's quite important because just, again, this is just illustrative purposes, but one person who also agrees that their position is that deer should be classified as game, they might have very different interests from someone else who holds that position. So different people can hold the same position for very different reasons, and other people can have very different interests but potentially hold a similar position. So it's really important to really pick these apart. And that's what my research is really hoping to do. So I've used media so far. And these are just an ad hoc sample of some of the statements that I've gathered from a media analysis. So these statements, most of them have come from the media. Some maybe from a workshop that we held a year ago. And what I'm doing really is trying to see how people are talking about deer and try and get some common themes coming out of this. So, for example, we can see here that one statement is that the government are still treating deer as protected species and not adopting a pest management approach that applies to other feral animals. Whereas another statement would say, well, declaring deer as pests will not change the deer problem. And so we can kind of find similarities in those two themes. And that would be around the categorization of deer. Yet we'd obviously need a bit more analysis because there's a lot of language in there that we could interrogate further, such as the use of feral, etc. Another example is perhaps around control methods, and some of these statements align with that theme, but actually we need to interrogate that further. So in relation to control methods, we have this statement here: aerial culling is expensive and ineffective. So it's about control methods, but it's actually talking specifically about one dimension of that, so the efficacy or the efficiency of those control methods. Whereas this other statement, we don't know if the public are on board with large-scale harvesting on public land. This is around the social acceptance of different control methods. So research and the social sciences, what we try to do is find similarities and patterns in the way people are perceiving the problem, but then really interrogate them and look at the various dimensions. So for example, with control methods, what are the various dimensions within those underpinning that as an issue? So another example here would be hunting tourism could provide economic opportunities for rural communities. So that's around the benefits of hunting to communities. But on the flip side, deer shooters are the biggest problem. Illegal hunting behaviour is a significant issue, and there's potential for serious collateral damage from deer. So that's another theme that we can get out of this. I would like to really highlight, though, that while this research is focusing on perceptions, they really need to be interrogated further. So when I do my interviews, I'm using these statements and a bigger list of statements to really interrogate how people think about these. How do they agree? Do they disagree? On what sort of scale of agreement or disagreement, and why? So really try to interrogate the underlying perceptions people have and how that can inform us. But I think it's also really important to recognise that these are statements from the press, the media, and a workshop. So these are people's perceptions. So they are not facts in and of themselves. So another layer of this interrogation is to really question what's coming out. So for example, one statement over here says, one issue relates to who determines what the sustainable number of deer is. Now that's a really good question. But what do we mean by sustainable? What does sustainable mean in this context, and how would we measure it? So there's more questioning that we need to do. And as social scientists, we may not be able to provide those answers. Not that we always provide answers. We often provide more questions. But it's sort of also illustrating how social sciences has a place in this, and it helps us see the bigger picture, but no discipline can work alone. So another example with this statement, eliminating deer and leaving behind hundreds of carcasses could simply be giving feral dogs a boost instead. Is that true? I certainly can't answer that or can't address that. So that raises a really valid question. And then we perhaps go back to our ecology and biology colleagues and say, can you show us some evidence? And how do we measure this? And what are the variables that might come into this? Is this dependent on species or vegetation, season, altitude, topography? And these are questions that, as a social scientist, I can't answer. But by asking some of these questions, we can look for more questions and direct some research into where we have knowledge gaps. On top of all of this, though, a critical part of the social sciences is that context matters. This isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening, we're talking about this now in 2020 in Northeast Victoria. But we have to think about the historical context. I mean, how long have deer been around? Well, we know from, the acclimatization societies and how they were released, but we have to think about how regulations have changed over time. How have rules around hunting and the interaction with humans and deer changed over time? What about relationships? How have relationships between different stakeholder groups been over time? What power relations are going on? What's the level of trust between different stakeholder groups? What about geography? Is it different in Doncaster than Wodonga or the area of the Alps, the high country? And is that just location, or is there an element of place attachment? Is there topography? How does that influence how people perceive this problem, or how deer themselves enact in this issue? What incentives do communities have to be involved in a deer management process? What incentives do hunters have to preferentially hunt the females? or volunteer hunters, what incentives do they have to be involved in deer management on public land? So that context really matters, I guess, is what I'm saying. And so that's a really important part of the social sciences, I think, that we do bring that context. And that's a lot of what Alex was saying before as well, about looking at the Australian level as a whole. We can start to see the bigger picture and pick apart where our local context is different, but what we can learn from a different scale. So this is where we get into extremism. And similar to Alex, I don't have a lot of answers here, but I think there's a lot more questions we could be asking, and some of them are really tricky. But these are some of the statements that I showed before around antisocial behaviour, illegal hunting behaviour, collateral damage, etc. And there's a real problem that we have with illegal hunting activity in the region, and the public feeling really unsafe about this. There is fear, there is an emotion. It's not just perceptions. We have values and ethics, but emotions as well. And I think one aspect that we can take from this is something that most stakeholders, if not all except the illegal hunters themselves, can really get behind. Illegal hunting is something that the hunters themselves have really tried to distance themselves from. And I think that's going to be increasingly more important into the future as we look to the future. And I really agree with Alex when she talked about that, looking at what the future might hold, because I think there are questions coming around the role of killing animals in these sort of programs. But one aspect that I think really needs more interrogation, and I'm looking forward to interrogating this further. But this is from the Stock and Land. It was July this year. It's an article about illegal hunting, and a farmer here. There were rum cans strewn across the roadside, and they've damaged his fence. And this same article is posted on this Facebook page, Victorian Sandbar Spotlighters, and they're essentially kind of mocking the article, mocking this farmer for not wanting illegal hunters on his property. And I think this raises the question around the role of social media in taking what is often or has previously been a site-specific or a location-specific issue and made it a more global issue even. And I think we really need to interrogate the role of social media in fueling some of these really illegal and antisocial behaviours. So we can see here that the second post is around truckee dust, drugs, rum, alcohol, spotlights, using axes. So this is really illegal activity, and it's using humour to sort of fly in the face of the rules and what is accepted behaviour. And I think there's a lot more interrogation that needs to be done around the role of humour and satire to really normalise what are some really antisocial behaviours. So I think social media is going to play an increasing role in this space in the future. And I know that many of you have probably seen this Facebook post before, but it shows the difference of opinions and values that we have within our society. And again, this picture, whether you like it or not, this normally, if this occurred, would be restricted to a specific location, but through social media, it's broadcasted more broadly. And the discussion around how we manage deer and the appropriateness or the social license of killing deer then starts to come into question. And I would put it back to you, I think some of the difficulty that we're having or we're going to have moving forward is in how we put boundaries around some of these conversations. So for example, when we talk about the community, what do we really mean by that? What is the community? And how do we how do we maintain deliberative quality, as Alex said, when the conversation can really be quite large in scale. But I would also sort of bring it back to the global context, and this is by no means something that Australia is dealing with by itself. And this is also true of the use of weapons for illegal hunting or poaching, but also the militarization of the response to that. Particularly in Africa, there's more militarization of conservation activities, and there are, it's far more common for rangers and poachers to be killed in the line of duty for whatever ends they're trying to achieve. But this open letter is from a group of conservation groups that work across a number of countries in Southern Africa, writing an open letter to celebrities in the UK, essentially saying, thanks for your interest, but you don't understand our context, you don't understand our local communities, and you really don't understand the benefits of regulated trophy hunting. So please either come and visit us or butt out, essentially, in a nice way. So I think this is a common theme around how global some of these discussions are starting to be had and how we manage that moving forward. But finally, moving forward, and looking towards the future, this is one area that I'm noticing a lot more in the academic literature. And I don't know if this is new for a lot of you or not, but this term theriocide. So essentially it means the killing of an animal. And it's used sort of analogously to homicide, so the killing of a person. And the literature will use language such as theorocida, and this has previously mostly been around illegal wildlife hunting or wildlife crimes, but I'm seeing it move more mainstream into just hunting, and the language changing from hunter or illegal hunter to killer, and the language from animal to victim. And then conflicts are seen between biodiversity and animals' rights to live. And that's being called state-sanctioned killing. And I agree with Alex, we need a lot of compassion when we talk about the killing of animals. But we also need to have a very sort of frank and robust debate about how we manage these issues into the future. And so we need really robust spaces for those discussions to take place. And so this is just a really interesting area that I thought I'd put on your radar if it's not already. So I'll finish up there and just acknowledge that CSU Green has been supporting my research so far. And I'll hand back over to Andrew. And I'm sorry, looks like my...
Okay,
Stop sharing.
Okay, thanks, Jen. I was just thinking there. Okay, so Jen, in the list of the running order for today, you did say that you would now give a quick summary of the issues and concepts discussed tonight before we move on to questions. Do you still want to do that?
Yeah, I'll do that. And I've got my screen on now. Sorry, everyone. Or maybe it's better. I don't know. Okay, so just really quickly, I've got a bit of a summary slide here about some of the issues that Alex and I were talking about tonight, and that's really around how the social sciences can help in this scenario. And I think that's around getting us to see the bigger picture, so thinking about the values and how these values and conflicts change over time. I think, Alex was talking about how some of the horse interactions and conflicts have changed a bit over time or evolved. It's also around ethics and remembering our compassion. And these are really tricky. These are really tricky concepts. In terms of the politicization, volatility, we're moving into litigation, and the role that social media is really playing in that. And that requires a little bit more interrogation, but it also requires us to really keep in mind that people are involved. We're all people, and it's not just compassion for animals, but compassion for your fellow human that's really important, and we can't lose sight of that. And I would say that then goes back to that deliberative quality that Alex was talking about, and I touched on as well, is we need processes that are robust enough to withstand some productive conflict and discussion without escalating. But that's easier said than done. But I think how we achieve that is by keeping in sight our context, but also thinking of what we can learn from other contexts, keeping all of that in mind, and really challenging some of our assumptions and continually asking questions. So that's how I see how the social sciences can really make a contribution to this space. So I'll hand back over to you, Andrew, unless Alex, you wanted to add anything to that.